friends, this is Mrs. Sharp. We're going to talk about these targets. I can identify symbols and events that represent American patriotism. I can explain ways people can work together effectively to make decisions. Here are some questions that we're going to talk about. What is patriotism? How is George Washington an example of American patriotism? How did George Washington work together with others to make decisions? What events was George Washington a part of that represent American patriotism? What makes George Washington unique? What is patriotism? Patriotism is having the feeling of pride for one's country. George Washington is an example of a person and symbol of American patriotism. George Washington. This is George Washington. He was the first president of the United States of America. Let's learn a little bit about George Washington. George Washington was the father of our country. George Washington is known as the father of our country. This is because he helped the United States of America become its own country. George Washington was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was born on February 22nd, 1732. When George Washington was 6 years old, his family moved to Stafford County, Virginia. Their farm was called Ferry Farm. He lived there for the rest of his childhood. George Washington was taught in his home by a tutor. He also went to a nearby school. George Washington learned reading, writing, and math. In 1749, George Washington got a surveyor license. He then worked as a land surveyor. A surveyor is a person who measures and makes maps for land. Major. In 1753, 21-year-old George Washington became a soldier in the military. He was a major in the military. That means he was in charge of a group of soldiers. Martha Washington. Martha Washington was George Washington's wife. He married Martha on January 6, 1759. George and Martha Washington did not have any of their own children together. She had 2 children of her own. Mount Vernon. This is the Washington's home in Fairfax County, Virginia. Their home was called Mount Vernon. Revolutionary War. At this time, America was ruled by a king. Many people did not like their laws that the king made. They wanted to have their own country. The king did not like this, and a war started called the Revolutionary War. Commander-in-Chief. In 1775, George Washington became the commander-in-chief of the American Army. This means he was the leader of the whole army. He helped America win the Revolutionary War and became a great hero. President. America was now a country called the United States of America. This country needed a president. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States of America. Pennsylvania. In 1790, George Washington, Martha Washington, and their 2 grandchildren moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. President's house. When George Washington was president, they lived in the president's house in Pennsylvania. White House. The White House is where the president lives when they are president. George Washington was the only president who did not live in the White House. This is because it was not built yet. George Washington was president for 8 years. After he was president, he went back to Mount Vernon, and he lived the rest of his life there. Washington Monument. The Washington Monument was built in Washington, D.C. to remember George Washington. Quarter. George Washington's picture is on the United States quarter. He can also be found on the $1 bill.